most of us can say we embrace it. It helps us define who we are in our families, in our communities, in our culture. It gives us a sense of time and place and a context for our lives. Thanksgiving Day, friend and family gatherings, turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, followed by a football game for some, or exercise to work off the calories. Our order of worship. We, as disciples of Christ at First Christian Church, proclaim God's sovereignty through affirmation of identity, music, prayer, scripture, proclamation, offering, and the Lord's Supper. Each and every Sunday we gather in this sanctuary. We are centered in our worship of God as we move through each part of the service that we have come to know and to expect and can enter into with surety. Of course, there are the frivolous traditions that can become passé. I just received a tongue-in-cheek email from a friend. Last day for straw hats and white shoes today. Now, the sanction for white shoes worn after Labor Day has disappeared. But some of you may remember the 80s movie Serial Mom, in which a character received a radical punishment for this fashion transgression. And then there are the traditions held so firmly that they exclude. It was a Saturday wedding at a Christian church. Following the ceremony, a young mother whose daughter was getting fussy took her downstairs to a Sunday school room to play. Shortly thereafter, she heard a woman explain, "Don't let your child touch the toys. They've already been disinfected for Sunday school." By strict adherence to pre-Sunday procedure, a Saturday child of God received the message that she was of less worth than her Sunday counterparts. Today's gospel text in the book of Mark puts before us a story about the tradition of the elders. The elders were the Pharisees and the scribes. According to Josephus, Jewish historian of the 1st century AD, the Pharisees were the group most influential with the Jewish people, were noted for their accurate and therefore authoritative interpretations of Jewish law, and had their own traditions and way of life to which they were faithful. And it is also worth mentioning that the Pharisees were not employed by the temple, so they lived out and about in the towns and the villages. The scribes also assumed leadership roles and were members of the learned class, who were particularly knowledgeable in Jewish law. As the passage begins, Jesus is teaching in Galilee. Some possibly local Pharisees and some scribes who had come from Jerusalem were gathered around Jesus. Jesus' ministry to this point in the book of Mark had included healing the sick and infirm, stilling a storm, raising the dead, feeding the 5,000, walking on water, and fraternizing with sinners and tax collectors. It is no wonder that Jewish leaders were interested in observing this rabbi whose radical behavior was building a substantial following. At the outset, the Pharisees and scribes wanted to know why some of the disciples were eating with unclean hands. For the Pharisees and scribes, this raised an issue of unobserved food laws, rather than a hygienic issue that today we might be inclined to note. The Pharisees and the scribes wanted to know why the disciples were not following the tradition of the elders. According to the historian Josephus, the Pharisees and scribes were referring to an oral tradition passed down from generation to generation and not found written in the laws of Moses, the Torah. Upon receiving this question, Jesus called the Pharisees and scribes hypocrites. To our modern ears, to be called a hypocrite would imply a stance of deliberate and knowing pretense. But in Greek, the noun stems from Greek drama, meaning to make believe or pretend, without the subjective accusation of intent to deceive. Nonetheless, Jesus' point was that focusing on traditions made by humans in place of focusing on the commandment of God to love God and neighbor is giving only lip service to faithfulness. Jesus does not criticize Judean traditions, but when traditions obscure or supersede God's commandment to love God and neighbor, Jesus points to the folly, in the Greek usage meaning evil designs. Evil designs of religious pretense. In the final section of today's passage, Jesus speaks not only to the Pharisees and the scribes, but to the crowd, and changes the focus from how a person eats to what a person eats, saying, what goes into the body doesn't defile, since it goes out, but what comes out from the heart, thought to be the center of feeling and emotion as it is today, can be evil. 12 vices are then listed as springing from the heart. True defilement, Jesus says, springs from within. So how might the community that first received the Gospel of Mark have heard this passage? The book of Mark is thought to have been written around 60 to 70 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, and is believed to have predated the books of Matthew and Luke. According to Gonzalez, historical theologian and author of The Story of Christianity, the earliest Christians did not consider themselves followers of a new religion. All their lives they had been Jews, and they still were. The earliest Christians did not reject Judaism, but were convinced that their faith was the fulfillment of the age-long expectation of a Messiah. So Judaic traditions continued, and as the Gentiles began to accept Jesus as the Messiah, conflicts arose over differences in Judaic and Gentile traditions. The Gospel of Mark may have been written in Syria, Italy, or some other place in the Roman Empire. It was written to be heard by a Gentile audience, as is evidenced by the explanation of food laws that Gentiles might not have been familiar with. The parenthetical explanation comes in verses 3 and 4. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders, and they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there were so many other traditions that they observed, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. Obviously, the audience was not Jewish, or they would have known these traditions. Now, some biblical scholars contend that the ritual washings listed in verses 3 and 4 were practiced only by priests or by certain groups of Pharisees. The Gospel of Mark may have been overstating the case on this point. However, the Gospel text is now serving a dual purpose. It related to the Gentile audiences Jesus' original message of inclusivity as he addressed the Pharisees' observation that some, but not all, of the disciples were not observing the traditional food laws. Furthermore, it presented Jesus' disciples as the models for breaking of these traditions, and thereby demonstrated to all Jesus' followers, be they Jew or Gentile, that they were included in God's family. Brian Blount, professor of New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary, states that by cleansing all foods, Jesus once again disposes a major barrier that separated Jews and Gentiles. Not only did Jews operate in a visibly different manner than Gentiles before eating the dietary washing traditions, they also consumed a different diet. Certain foods were considered unclean, and because Gentiles ate them, they too were considered unclean by association. According to Mark, Jesus was now wiping out that distinction and thereby shattering the boundary it had imposed. Therefore, if all foods were considered clean, it became possible for Gentiles in Mark's community to eat their food, while Jewish members could continue eating in a Jewish way. And now, it became possible for Jews and Gentiles to eat together, to break bread together, a tradition in which we engage each Sunday. And so Jesus' teaching can speak to us all, regardless of the century in which we live. We are allowed to embrace our traditions of faith as long as our faith traditions do not work toward excluding other children of God, and that would be all humans. Excluding children of God from communally upholding God's commandment to love God and love neighbor. In the words of Allen and Williamson, disciples of Christ theologians, the test of faithfulness is not simply whether one abides by group conventions, things that go in, but is the quality of one's life, things that come out. With God's help, may our daily thoughts and actions that comprise our lives pass this test of faithfulness and thereby honor God. Amen.